Hey everyone, we have a special guest today. We're going to be reviewing media clips from film that depict Roman fortifications and frontiers, particularly Hadrian's Wall over the centuries. So our guest is Adrian Goldsworthy, and I'll let him introduce himself.
Hello, I'm Adrian Goldsworthy, as just been explained. So I've worked a lot on the army, on frontiers, on bases. I've even dabbled in fiction. I've got my Vindolanda series of stories about Flavius Ferox, which is set just before the building of Hadrian's Wall. And the sort of underlying theme of the stories is all about why they have to build it. So the whole question of frontiers, what life was like, and how the Roman army worked is one very dear to my heart. So I'm going to enjoy talking about it today.
2 years on the frontier. This place is the arsehole of the world. Even the land wants us dead.
I rather like this film. I've got a soft spot for it, but when it flashes up Inch Tutil and this picture of this tiny little Roman outpost, it always makes me giggle because the real site of Inch Tutil, which has been excavated, was an entire legionary fortress. So that's designed to accommodate a legion of 5,000 or so men. So it's a really big complex, like a small town. It's never quite finished. They never built the commander's house, for instance. Within a few years, frontier policy had changed. The army was withdrawn from southern Scotland, where this is. So that's the sort of historical background. That all happened there's the famous governor of Britain, Agricola, the father-in-law of Cornelius Tacitus, the famous historian, who governed Britain, got to the top of Scotland, had a squadron of ships sail around the north of Scotland and proved Britain was actually an island, which they weren't 100% sure about. They thought it probably was, but they weren't quite sure it wasn't another continent. So Agricola's done all of that. He sets down Inch Tutil, a whole complex of forts and outposts and signal stations that we call the Gas Ridge, a bit to the south, which again has been excavated. And Inch Tutil just lasts a few years, is never quite finished. Then they pull back. Gas Ridge lasts a little bit longer, but by the turn of the century, from the sort of 84, 85-ish AD, by about 100, almost everything's been withdrawn from Scotland, particularly Scotland north of where Edinburgh and Glasgow is, that line there, the Fourth Clyde, has all gone, the Roman garrisons there. So that bit's always just it's nice they've used the name in a sense, even though it's modern, not ancient. But it's just a little bit strange. You're having to change your perspective from imagining a whole legion in this base to this outpost of a few dozen men. It's fairly basic. It's a nice set by Hollywood standards. Doesn't look too much like a Roman fortlet. There'd probably be a couple more towers. Might be a bit more organized inside, but you do have these little outposts like this. And the convention is for historians and archaeologists. If it's got a whole legion in, it's a fortress. If it's got a complete auxiliary unit, it's a fort. If it's smaller than that, but has still got a headquarters building in it, then it's a fortlet. And then anything else becomes things like the mile castles and the turrets and the outposts and all that sort of thing. But there's a gradation. But the Romans don't use those terms. Those are modern ones we've invented. So it's not bad. It's quite fun. You then get into the leading into the story and talking about how the Caledonians are wearing down the occupying forces. There's some truth in that, but as far as we can tell, the probability is the Romans withdraw because it's too expensive and they need the troops. There's a big crisis on the Danube. The Dacians, Sarmatians, people like that have been inflicting defeats on the Roman army there. So the Emperor Domitian starts just withdrawing troops from Britain to send there. So it's probably more about a sort of cost benefit calculation. The Romans look at how many troops they might need to garrison this place and of sort of what's now Scotland, and how much revenue they're going to get from it, and is it actually worthwhile doing this? And the decision seems to be that it isn't. So that's less dramatic than in a story where you've got the depiction of the Roman army coming up against some form of fighting that it can't really understand, it can't cope with, which is not really how things work because the Romans have encountered this sort of warfare in lots of other places. And if they're determined enough and willing to spend the troops and keep them there for a long time, then they can win. I think they're trying to draw on a sort of Vietnam parallel almost, but even there, you could say that, well, US armed forces could win every battlefield encounter. It's just a question of is politically and financially, is this worth doing? and do we want to do this? So whilst the insurgents can see this as a military victory, it sort of is and it sort of isn't. It isn't won purely on the battlefield. It's won just by persuading the enemy to go away. There's an element of that probably in what's happening in northern Britain, but there's always this debate in Britain and in other areas of the Roman province of just where should we settle down? What's worth taking? And you have an attitude in the imperial period, the rule of emperors, where actually they start thinking, we could take it, but it isn't worth the money. And there's a famous story of Agricola, the chap I mentioned before, the one who built Inchtutil. A prince from Ireland is supposed to have fled, having been chased out of his kingdom, his tribal kingdom in Ireland, fled to Agricola and asked to be restored to power. And Agricola has this throwaway line, oh, I could conquer Ireland with one legion and its auxiliaries, but it wouldn't be worth doing. It's just, we wouldn't benefit from it. And there have been similar ideas expressed about Britain itself before the Romans finally went there. So there is this calculation. The empire's big, the army's big, but it isn't a big army in proportion to the sheer size of the empire. And like most governments throughout history, the Romans don't particularly like paying for forces that they're not necessarily using. So there's some nice bits in here. It's got a nice look. It's an atmospheric set. It's quite a dramatic scene when the Caledonians turn up. The one thing I'll say as an aside as well, it's slightly cut the way we've seen the clip because obviously, this is YouTube, but you've got the Centurion sort of wanders up, stands up on the parapet and starts to urinate into the ditch. And then, well, spoiler alert, but it doesn't go terribly well for him because the attackers are turning up. There's actually some evidence from Hadrian's Wall of men stationed in turrets in the outposts of just them chucking their rubbish into the ditch in front of the wall because it piles up and it gets sort of, creates a sediment. You can discover it archaeologically. So there's an element of truth in that apart from the casual thing. But remember, these are Roman army bases. Every base of any side would have its purpose-built latrine area. So the Romans have some sense of hygiene. They do understand that you've got to be careful with crowding lots of people into a fort that they don't all get sick. So, it's nice. It's got a nice look. It's interesting. The tents are quite nice. This one's pretty good in the Hollywood tradition, as if you don't look too closely, then the gear, the equipment's pretty decent. You can tell these are Romans of about the early 2nd century AD. Though they're all legionaries throughout the film. Occasionally people ride horses, but even they seem to be legionaries. The auxilia, the non-citizen soldiers that are half the Roman army, just don't appear at all. So it's quite nice. I quite like the look of the start of this, but it's, as I say, sure as heck isn't a fortress of 5,000 men.
All leave is cancelled. Agricola's mobilizing the 9th. We're going to war, Septus. Alert the senior legates to break camp and prepare the men.
Yeah.
Sorry, General, sir.
Turn to Agricola at once. Tell him we rode out within the hour.
Yes, General.
The film draws on the uncertainty amongst scholars of what happened to Legio IX Hispana, as does one of the other films we'll look at, The Eagle, based on the Rosary Sutcliffe, The Eagle of the Ninth story. As far as we can tell, the Ninth Legion does cease to exist, but we don't really know what happened to it. And but that's so they're making up a fictional explanation for this. You have some problems with this, the way they present things, in that they have a governor who's very much a civilian and wants to go home. You've got the commander of the Ninth Legion, who's this sort of hard-nosed soldier. Well, in real life, the commander of a Roman legion was a Roman senator just about 10 years younger than the man who was the governor. They're both politicians who do some military service. So they're a mixture of soldier and civilian all the way through. There isn't this break that we have in the modern world, particularly the Western world, between the army and the state, the army and politics. The shot they have, I think they call it Carlisle, of the fort there. It's bigger than the real one at Carlisle, but it's quite impressive. Although, weirdly, a lot of the tent lines are outside the rampart. Now, that was actually a punishment for troops that were decimated, where you executed 1 in 10, and then the remaining 90% were supposed to sleep outside the rampart and camp there rather than. But again, it gives a good idea of numbers. And it's quite nice. You get the army marching out, or the legion marching out, apparently on its own. and going off to deal with this. Now, Inchtutil is quite a long way away from Carlisle. So it's like most movies, the geography's just been compressed quite dramatically. It's the same way in The Lord of the Rings that, as any fan will know, Tolkien's maps are reduced greatly in size for the benefit of the films, where people just rush around the place all the time and get somewhere quite quickly. But it's not bad. The idea of you go to a unit that you haven't really given a warning order to, and they're ready to move out in an hour is, stretching things a little bit.
Cannot return to Rome in disgrace. Better that the fate of the Legion remain a mystery than the truth of their failure be known.
If word gets out, every tribe and every nation will rise against us.
It's too great a risk.
Are we agreed then? The fate of the 9th Legion will be struck from the record.
Aye.
So we have the 9th sent off to deal with this problem and sort it out. And of course, it all goes horribly wrong in the way that it often does in movies, where armies get ambushed very easily and wiped out. You then have the governor, who, his wife is clearly this sort of slightly sinister influence going on, and he talks with his staff and talks about, well, if nobody knows what happens to the 9th, we can just leave it a mystery. I don't think there are many governments in history, let alone Roman emperors, who would excuse a governor who just said, well, I used to have 3 legions, now I've got 2, and I don't know what happened to the 3rd, but I'm sure it's all right. It's nothing to worry about. That somehow that's better than actually reporting that it's been destroyed, because the commander of the 9th Legion, the commander of any legion, is a senator. He's got family that are really important. You've got equestrian tribunes and senatorial tribune. You've got an awful lot of centurions who are quite important people as well. So people are going to notice this. And so this is one of those concepts that is completely off the wall in Hollywood. However, the idea of saving face, in one sense, helps us to understand how frontiers work. It comes back to this idea that you defend yourself by looking strong and intimidating. And the Romans have to appear as the biggest, meanest, toughest kid on the block so that nobody messes with them. And ideally, if you present that view of yourself as utterly invincible, then maybe people won't fight you at all, or they won't fight you with any great confidence, and they'll probably lose. So actually, this does help us to understand a little bit about how frontiers work. And again, it's speculation because the sources aren't there, but I do rather wonder. There's talk of serious losses under the Emperor Trajan, Hadrian's predecessor in Britain. There is a tombstone of a centurion who was an acting commander of an auxiliary unit. It's found at Vindolanda, a chap called Titus Annius, who is interfectus in bello, killed in a war that seems to date around this time. So something's going on in Britain. And I do wonder if, not the way they're doing it here, but actually the withdrawal of the 9th Legion to go off and do other things elsewhere is, with the withdrawal of other troops that clearly happens in the latter part of the 1st century AD, along with pulling back from places like Inchtutil, which is deliberately demolished by the Roman army. You often find there were thousands of Roman iron nails that they just buried because they were too heavy. They couldn't be bothered to cart them away, and they didn't want the locals to have access to all this iron that they could turn into weapons. So they often turn up in sort of amateur collections and private collections and sort of things. There's just loads of the things. The Romans deliberately pull back, but from a local perspective, given that you probably have very little idea of the geography of the wider world, no real concept of how big the Roman Empire is, as far as you're concerned, the Romans are retreating, the Romans are going. So from a political point of view, is it worth getting on with the Romans anymore? Do you need to make them happy? Is it more important to carve out a niche for yourself, a power base, compared to the other tribes, the other chieftains within your tribe, other leaders around? So there's a lot of presenting a facade, trying to save face, looking strong on both sides. That's how you get this interaction, this friction on a lot of frontiers, where the locals are trying to prove themselves because that's good for them politically. The Romans are trying to show off how strong they are. Both sides tend to attack the other to demonstrate their own strength. And while that might frighten the victim of these attacks, it also means they want vengeance in the long run whenever you're perceived as weak. So being perceived as weak, which is probably how many local peoples would have seen the Romans in the latter part of the 1st century AD and the start of the 2nd century AD in northern Britain, that means you think, well, the Romans are weak, we better do something, this is the time if we want to attack them, this is a good time to do it. So again, I think you can lead on to something that reflects the reality, but this is very contrived, and I'm not even sure makes that much logic in the context of the film. But anyway, it's how they decided to round things off.
Agricola has fallen back. Emperor Hadrian has given orders to form a new defensive line to the south. This is Hadrian's big fucking plan? A wall?
Hey, who cares? We made it, huh?
You've got this nice scene in the film where they go to the Inch-Tutil. I think it's supposed to be Inch-Tutil because that's been destroyed, but it's obviously the same set. They've just sort of messed up a bit more. What I quite like is that the note they see pinned on the post is actually in Roman cursive script. So that's quite nice to see, because normally we're familiar with the sort of the letters you see on inscriptions, but that's a flavor of the sort of writing you'll see on the Vindlander or Carlisle writing tablets. So then they go further south, and they discover, much to their dismay and disgust, that Hadrian's plan is building this wall. Again, as I say, we don't know. We don't have good evidence as to why Hadrian does this. One of the big problems with Hadrian's wall is that it's unique. You have the Antonine Wall further north, but that's different in many aspects of design, occupied for a few years before they go back to Hadrian's Wall later in the 2nd century. But there isn't another one anywhere else. There are lots of different frontier systems. There are stockades in Germany, and parts linking between the Rhine and Danube frontiers. And if you don't have a lot of information to go on, the unique is incredibly hard to understand. So Hadrian's Wall is something that we try to deduce its function from excavation. And the more we learn of it, the more we try and work out, we can see the sequence in which it was designed, how there were major design changes from early on. But we're having to guess this, and we're having to work out what it's for. Clearly the obvious thing, and this sort of feeds into the whole Game of Thrones stuff, is that, well, it's a wall, it divides, there's one side and the other, and that's where the empire stops. And, here we go. One thing that they even show in this scene that's quite nice, though, is that all along the wall, there are lots of gateways from its very first design. You have these things we call mile castles. Every Roman mile, roughly, an outpost for a small garrison, a bit like their Inch-Tutil, but in stone, with a gateway to the north, a gateway to the south, so a path through the wall. So actually, it does look as if this was never meant to be a barrier to the Romans, but it's a barrier where you control all movement through it to anybody else. And, there are theories that you're also dividing off tribes to the north from tribes to the south. Maybe they collaborated, or are you protecting the tribes to the south? But it's one of those puzzles. So it's something where there aren't any hard and fast answers. And as one very experienced wall scholar once told me, when I said I'd been working on this, I'd been looking at it, and I felt the more I read, the more confused I get about Hadrian's Wall. And his comment was, well, I think you're going on the right lines now, because every time we think we've worked something out, there's a discovery that changes just a little bit of detail as to how we understand how it may actually have worked. The bulk of the Roman army is up in the north, but there are significant numbers of troops in southwest of what's now England, so Devon, Cornwall, that sort of area, some of which is quite marshy, and broken country like this. So I do like the scene of the cows swimming across the river as they're poling along in the punt to get there. There are also more garrisons in Wales, where again you've got quite mountainous areas, and there are 2 legions, 2nd Augusta and 20th Valeria Victrix, that are sort of on the borders, the fringes of what is now Wales, that could go to the north, could go to the west. Most of the southeast, Londinium, that sort of area, doesn't have any substantial garrisons. So most of the southeast seems very settled, very peaceful. The fringes, less so. As I say, I quite like this sort of a suggestion of marshy area and all this sort of thing. Just where I live now, a little bit to the east along the coast, there is area of farmland now where we found from the inscriptions it was actually reclaimed from the sea by Second Augusta Legion late in the first into the second century AD, and it's still no longer salt marshes; it's now proper farmland. So the Romans reclaimed some areas, but there were also areas of Britain that were a lot wilder still than they are today. So that's quite nice. And then you move on to this outpost fort that is still, it's too small for a Roman fort for an auxiliary unit of theoretical strength 480 or so men, which is what it's supposed to be in the book. And I think he talks about it. But again, you can't afford that. Budgets are got to stay within manageable things. And when the garrison arrives to replace the soldiers there, okay, most cohorts probably wouldn't be anything like their full strength. We've got records on papyrus from Vindolanda that suggests 50%, 70% would be more common for much of the time, and that even from those troops, some of them would be detached on, posted off to different duties here, there, and everywhere, so not actually with the unit. But it's not a bad reflection of a Roman fort in the earlier periods. Those were turf and timber in the main. So when they show them sort of plastering mud onto the rampart, that's suggesting it's an earth bank. Actually, they tended to be built from turf, big turf blocks, which seem to hold together. By this sort of time, by about the 140s AD, there wouldn't be probably any of these left in Britain. Early part of the second century, nearly everything gets rebuilt in stone. However, sometimes turf is still used, and the western third of Hadrian's wall was originally built not in stone but in turf and timber. Would look more like this. So they used it. One of the problems with turf is that actually you need a very wide area to be able to strip it to form the rampart. So stone can sometimes be cheaper, but turf has always been the quick, easy fix Roman army solution. It's how they build marching camps whenever they can. So this isn't bad. It's probably not quite right for the period, as are some of the other details, but it's not bad. And it gives you a sense. The fort is a little bit more open. Roman army bases, when you look at them, are really crowded with buildings. And they've got their main two roads forming a sort of T-junction with the commander's house and the Praetorium, then the Principia, the headquarters building, where the junction is. There isn't so much space inside. You'd be doing most of your training and things outside because it's crammed full of barrack blocks. It's crammed full of granaries and storehouses. The way to think about it is if you look at a plan of a medieval castle, the thing that jumps out to you are these big walls, big towers, that sort of thing. It's clearly meant for defense. You look at a Roman fort, it's where the army lived, because what jumps out is accommodation and storage space. And it's very densely packed with those, whereas the ramparts are relatively modest. It's nice where they show them sort of improving the stakes, clearing out the ditch, that sort of thing. They're still formidable, but they're nowhere near as formidable as the Romans could have built if they wanted to. But they know they're dealing with enemies that have no knowledge at all of siegecraft, so it has to be fairly simple. The second thing is, and this ties in a little bit with the Centurion, the instinct of the Roman army, even when they're in a fort and the fort gets attacked, is to march out and fight in the open, because you're still convinced you're the best soldiers in the world and you can hammer everyone. It's a mark of confidence. So it doesn't always work, but surprisingly often, we'd expect everybody to think, well, I've got this defensive position, I'm going to stay there, wait for you. But it's about dominating the ground outside, seizing the initiative, being very aggressive, dominating the minds of the enemy to try and again present them, look, we're invincible, you just haven't got any hope, don't bother to try and fight us at all. So they do that in another way. They do sally out of the fort eventually, but that doesn't work. Whereas it's quite nice they have the thing about patrolling. I know it's partly for the plot, but one of the biggest dangers when we come along archaeologically and look at Roman forts, we look at Hadrian's Wall, we look at the mile castles on it, turrets, all these sorts of things, and we look at the barracks within them, we can very easily jump to the conclusion that, well, of course, this is where the army lives, this is where the soldiers perform their role. But it's not. It's where the army sleeps, it's where it eats, it's where it trains, maintains its equipment. But it isn't where the army expects to fight or operate. For that, you actually need to go back to Centurion and the idea you have your 9th Legion in its camp, there's a problem, so the 9th marches out and hits the enemy in the open. Okay, it doesn't go well for them in the film, but that's the idea. You have the only true professional army in the world. It is far more efficient than anyone else out there. It is very good at fighting in the open, and it's not very numerous. You couldn't guard the Roman Empire by stationing men everywhere. So if you just think about a fort as somewhere where it lives, and then think that, well, even if you think of them moving fairly slowly, in a day, the garrison there, or part of the garrison, could march 15, 20 miles. Okay, less maybe if the terrain's tough, but something like that. In a week, it's a very long way away from that fort. So simply plotting on the map where the garrisons are and saying, oh, there's a concentration here, it must be because there's a big problem here, something they've got to defend. Actually, the key thing about forts is communications. They tend to be sometimes in passes to control them, but they're usually near a road, like the road along which or in front of which they'll build Hadrian's Wall. All the big legionary bases are on a river because you want to be able to bring in supplies by water. It's much cheaper, it's much more efficient. So actually the army's stationed so that it can concentrate quickly to be sent to where it needs to go. You will get cases like the ones in the story where a garrison comes under attack. But that's, again, when things have gone wrong. The idea normally is to anticipate what the locals are doing, hence patrolling, hence the regional centurions, the legionary, people like that, who go out, sit in on tribal councils, tribal meetings. You have Bewcastle, north of Hadrian's Wall, is a peculiarly shaped Roman fort, because it actually seems to be built around a pre-existing Iron Age shrine. And the odds are this is some sort of center for one tribe, perhaps more, that the Romans then control so they can supervise what's going on there, who's meeting there. But again, it isn't, you don't build these walls and then, as suggested in the story, oh, it's too dangerous, we shouldn't go out, we shouldn't talk to anybody. It's all about, you are representatives of the Roman state. So you are out there to interact. These are not places that are constantly, or most of the time, under siege. This is where the army lives, but it goes out from this. And that's probably true even of the tiny outpost. Which is more like a police station, that sort of thing. So it's a different way of thinking about what these are. We have to remember not to just assume that because this is the bit we've found, that's the evidence that's important, and everything important happens there. So you've got this battle scene when the fort's attacked because they've ambushed the patrol, the druids raised the locals against them, and it's quite fun. There aren't very many good descriptions of Roman forts under attack in this period, but that's a reflection of our sources. But okay, I'm not sure about the fire and things. Centurion gets wounded, gets invalided out of the army, and decides on a personal initiative to go off and try and find the lost eagle of the Ninth Legion. So it's sort of tying in with Centurion. So he and his faithful British slave, now freedman, travel up to Hadrian's Wall pretending to be a doctor and his assistant. And they come to the wall, so that's quite nice. You see a bit of Hadrian's Wall. It's clearly from the area not far from Housestead's fort today, and they've even left in, when you see the long view, the woodland that's there. I suspect at the time, any woodland right by the wall itself would have been cleared, not least because from a practical point of view, the Romans needed the timber as material for building, but also for scaffolding when they're building the wall. So that's where they've obviously based it on the real landscape today. And you see it sort of, this is the central section of Hadrian's Wall, is very hilly, very high like that, undulating, very dramatic. The east and the western are much flatter, more gently rolling thing. They come to what's a mile castle, and it's quite a nice representation of mile castles that you've seen in illustrations. For my personal thing, it always sparks with is when I was growing up, Airfix, the company that used to make model kits in plastic, they had a model Roman mile castle, which was one of my most prized possessions. So, and it looked very much like the one they have here. So, there's lots of issues about that, but we'll talk about how they show the wall, I think, a bit next time. What's nice is that it does show that you can get through the wall. On the other hand, you have the rather surly Roman soldiers that are garrisoning it. They are supervising who's going through. So that's interesting, but they then give the idea that, oh, well, no Romans can survive up there, you've had it, and all this sort of thing, because it's too dangerous. That presents the idea that the wall is where Rome stops and that there's nothing beyond it. And they do, people express this idea in several of the films. Again, not really true, because the Romans have outpost forts beyond Hadrian's wall. And one interesting thing that was pointed out a while back in an article by Mark Corby is that if you look at the troops that are stationed on the wall, a quarter of them are cavalry. Now, unless you go to the whole Return of the King, Gandalf riding along the walls of Minas Tirith thing, you don't have cavalry defending walls or inside forts. They're there for mobility. So again, it's an emphasis on how far the Romans wanted to be able to project force in front of the wall. So this is rather artificial. It's also striking when they go to the north, this is the end of the world, all this sort of stuff. There's almost nobody there. And that's the same in Centurion. What will become Scotland is incredibly sparsely populated. There's no sign of settlements. You see they talk to a few shepherds and people like that. Actually, the evidence is now suggesting we're discovering through aerial archaeology, through survey work, field walking, there seem to be a lot more settlements north of the wall than we used to think, a lot more Iron Age farmsteads. There aren't many concentrated opulent towns. There are a few, but it's lots of little groups of 3 or 4 or 5 roundhouses, a family, extended groups, and cattle, that sort of thing. So there should be rather more people out there. This isn't quite the wilderness that it gets presented in the films. One sort of irony of setting the film in around about 140 AD is that this is the reign of Antoninus Pius, and Antoninus Pius sent instructions to abandon Hadrian's wall. So they actually physically took the gates off their posts and slighted the ditch, all this sort of thing, and went north and built the Antonine Wall, which is on the narrowest part of the British Isles, where you've got basically, again, Fourth Clyde Line, where Glasgow, Edinburgh are today. They built another wall, but this one out of turf and timber, occupied it for maybe 10 years, maybe a bit more, before deciding that that wasn't such a good idea, and they pulled back to Hadrian's Wall. It's then occupied for the remaining 2.5 centuries of the Roman province. So it again shows that Roman frontier policy isn't this simplistic thing. They don't just build this, say, that's it, we've stopped, civilization, the empire ends here. There's lots of politics, there's lots of diplomacy, there's different theories about how you should deal with this, clearly going on all the time, that don't really appear in our sources. Again, we just see the archaeology for this is what's happening. But Hadrian's Wall will remain in occupation, in use, right up until the sort of formal end of Roman Britain as a province, round about AD 410. And in some cases, there are clear signs of it being occupied, or parts of it being occupied afterwards. We're moving on now with a big jump in time from the 2nd century AD into the 5th century. I can't remember. It's a while since I've watched King Arthur with Keira Knightley in it and all this sort of thing, in the which has the Sarmatian knights as Arthur and his knights there. There are not very many of them. There's only about 6 or 7 of them, but they're considered to be very formidable, keeping the frontier going. And they have adventures around and then to the north of Hadrian's Wall. But early on in the story, you get maybe a glimpse of what Hadrian's Wall is for, because you have an ambush scene where a Roman official's turning up, there's a carriage, there's an escort. One of the few times we see something like Roman auxiliary cavalry, although not in the sort of uniforms they would have been wearing in the 5th century. Again, this hasn't really moved forward to how we think the army looked then. The Picts burst out of the trees, ambush them, and there's a quick fight before the Sarmatians turn up to save the day. And then it's typical Hollywood stuff. We come back to the theme that will go through all the ancient world and right the way to a galaxy far, far away, and that armor does you no good at all, because the arrows just kill these men, go straight through their cuirass, anything like that. It's a waste of time. It's just there to look good. So you have this fight, you have this attack, Sarmatians turn up. Now, this is a fairly small-scale raid against a small-scale target, but that's probably the most common form of violence in the Iron Age world, and then in the period of the Roman Empire, by extension, because most of the societies the Romans are dealing with are organized at quite a low level. So it's an individual chieftain with as many warriors as he could persuade to go with him, with the promise of, we'll come back with booty, but also we'll come back. It's something we've got to remember when we try and understand the frontiers, that most of the raids, most of the attacks are not intended to be suicide missions. These are by people who want to gain glory, prestige, gain vengeance, whatever it might be, but go home to enjoy all of those things. So the danger for the Romans is that too many of them get home boasting about too many successes, because that will encourage rather more to come next year. The raids will get bigger and bigger, and eventually you might have a really big problem on your hands. So that's why things like Hadrian's Wall are there to channel this, make it difficult to get in, even more difficult to get out with all the plunder of animals, of captives, of swag, whatever it might be that you're trying to take home with you. The Romans obviously need to intercept any raiding group. Now, in the story, it sort of happens almost by accident that they turn up and the Sarmatians save the day. But that's why you have all these outpost lines, why you have these turrets, why you have these fortlets, these little bases. So there's lots of people out there looking, and there are the patrols that we get in the movie The Eagle. You go out, you put eyes on the thing, you look, you try and spot things. You also create the impression to people that unless they move slowly and stealthily, they're going to be seen. Once they're seen, they're going to be reported. In time, someone in a bigger garrison will put together a force of troops that can go out, chase you down. And there's a sadly lost inscription by an auxiliary prefect who talks about setting this up in Thanksgiving because he's wiped out a group of warriors from this tribe that we never hear attested any other occasion. So it's presumably a very small group, and smaller still after he's fought them. That's the impression you get. Very small scale. You've got to catch them, but you need to know where they are before you can chase them, and then you've got to find them. So attacking the Roman Empire, it's a little bit like launching an air raid. You know you're going to want to end up back at home, landing at your base. You know that it'll be hard for them to meet you coming in. So because even with radar and things like that, yes, it will report them, but they're still moving very quickly. And then that report's got to go to someone, and you've got to scramble aircraft to intercept. They've got to physically travel that distance to do that. In the ancient world, everything's far slower. You can send basic signals with smoke, light a beacon, something like that. You can use flags, maybe some others, but those are basic messages, sort of basically alarm a problem, something to look out for, therefore send out some proper patrols to go and see what's going on. Everything else has to be written down and then physically carried, or carried in the man's head and reported that way. And it is interesting. There has been some good work done on Hadrian's Wall, that the mile castles that we thought of originally, this is just very bureaucratic, every mile they build one of these things. Actually, they shift position by up to a couple of 100 yards from where they should be, so that they're in the best position to be seen by the largest garrison nearby. So they could be seen, they're not in contact with each other, because if you've got 20 odd men at a mile castle, there isn't that much point in raising the alarm with the 20 more men who are over to the east or over to the west. But there is a real benefit from going back to the garrison of 500 or 1,000 men that's a few miles away and saying to them, look, we're in trouble. There's some bad guys about. You need to do something about this. And that's clearly how it's all structured. You can see the same pattern on other Roman frontiers as well. Between an outpost and a major fort, then they build a relay station, another tower on top of the hill, so it can basically pass the message along. Again, it just has to be a simple alarm, but it's something to get you going. Means that in the main garrison, you can start saying, okay, let's get 50 men, 60 men, whatever it might be, ready to move in 1 hour's notice or 2 hours notice, ready with field equipment, horses ready, because obviously cavalry are the people most suited to chasing any raiders. So it's, again, makes sense in the film. You've got the Sarmatians riding up to save the day. But again, comes back to this fact that we've got 25% of the soldiers stationed in and around Hadrian's Wall are cavalrymen, because they need to be able to get to the problem quickly. But they're also the best people to go out looking for it as well, to recce, report what they see, and then ride back with the messages to say, look, there's trouble. We need to do something about this. So horsemen are really important. And there's a little bit of evidence from some of the horse trappings and things found like that, that even a mile castle may have had 1 or 2 horses in it, at least some of the time, which again would make sense. You don't need a force of cavalrymen, but you need somebody who can get on a horse and then gallop as fast as they can with a detailed report to the area where you've got a concentration of troops that can start to gather people together to deal with it. So there's a lot that's quite nice in the way this works, even if it's a little stylized. It's very Hollywood in the way it fights. But there's a basic link between this and what you get later on in the film, which is the big invasion, the big attack. Let's think of it more as a major raid. In the film, I think the Angles or the Saxons, whoever they are coming to migrate and settle, and they have this sort of slightly National Socialist thing where the chieftain orders them to kill even captive women because, we can't breed with these people. We've got to be pure of race and all this sort of thing. There's some slightly weird stuff in there, but nevertheless, the idea is you've got a big army of lots and lots of dangerous warriors turning up. That's not the normal, the everyday situation. The common thing is the raiding, the small scale one, where you're coming to steal a few cows, take a few heads, take a few captives. Now, there's an interesting case of a legal document that talks about a woman who had been, for a criminal offense, said to be a slave and working in possibly a salt pans area, salt mine, that area, is captured by raiders and then sold into the Roman Empire. So you've got someone who's stolen from the Roman Empire and then sold back in another bit of the frontier by people who are making a profit. So people are a valuable resource that can be taken as captives. That's small scale. That's what happens most of the time. If you don't stop enough of those raids, then everybody gets to think, well, the Romans are pretty weak and they've got lots of nice, fancy, expensive stuff that we'd like to steal. So next year, instead of going with 10 people, okay, maybe 20 will join you or 50 will join you. If the 50 succeed, after that, maybe it's 300 or 1,000. These things escalate. As long as you're perceived to be weak and vulnerable, then people will attack you. And of course, the whole culture of basically trying to intimidate across the frontiers from the Roman point of view really doesn't mean that people have any reason to like you. So apart from all the advantages and all the fancy, nice, rich stuff you've got, then there is a good reason for them to think, well, I remember that you burnt down my grandfather's house, all those years ago. Why should I like you? Now it's your turn. So these things tend to work both ways. This sort of emphasis on dominance, by aggressive campaigning beyond the frontier, also means that whenever you're seen as weak, then people are likely to come. And there's an interesting incident in the 4th century where Ammianus Marcellinus talks about Roman soldiers from the Germanic tribes going back on leave to their home tribes and casually mentioning that most of the army in Gaul is going to be moving east before the winter comes. So this rumor goes around the tribes and a big band of raiders comes in because they think that the Roman army isn't going to be there. You raid because you want to come in, take what you want, and go back to celebrate and sing about your great deeds and to enjoy the spoils. So again, it's about perception. That's why the little raids really matter. And in many respects, it's the little raids that things like Hadrian's Wall are best designed to deal with. Because okay, there's a mile castle every Roman mile. There's turrets, 2 turrets between them usually. There might be sentries patrolling the walkway on top of the wall. If there is a walkway on top of the wall, that's a subject that's debated. You can probably sneak past with a dozen or so men. However, once you've done that, you go in, you get into the Roman province, you start to steal things, you start to kill people, do whatever you want. The chance of your being spotted increases. You've then got to get home, and it's going to be much harder getting back across that wall with all the plunder, with your captives, with the sheep you've stolen. It's much harder to haul them across an 18-foot wall than it is to do it just with a few of you stealthily getting in. So it makes it much harder to get home. And aspects like the vallum, this big ditch behind the wall, make it even more difficult again. So it's a tripwire. It gives warning to the Romans, but it also slows down everybody going in and particularly coming out. Now, when you come to these bigger attacks, this one's presented as it ends up with a mass attack on Hadrian's Wall itself. And again, it's good Hollywood, spectacular stuff. It's typical Hollywood battle. There's smoke, there's fire, there's very simplistic tactics that don't quite add up. The wall is presented. This is supposed to be, into the 5th century. Whether it's quite as neat as that is arguable by this point. Some forts are maintained after the Romans have left. There's the sort of weird bit in the film where the Roman garrison is there and then this official who's come just takes them all away. So every Roman soldier goes home and just the Sarmatians and the Picts are left to defend the wall against these oncoming Germans. If you look at the wall, the way it's presented, it's a possible representation. Nowadays, most people have turned against the idea that the wall was sort of rendered and whitewashed, but it's big, it's impressive. One thing that none of these reconstructions of the wall has is the ditch that ran along the front of almost all of it. It's only in places like the windsill, the really craggy areas in the central section where basically you're standing on top of a cliff that they don't bother with a ditch. But everywhere else, there should be a ditch in front of the wall. And for some reason, that gets missed out. You also don't have the vallum, which is this ditch complex with some banks behind the wall that sort of demarcates the military zone. Again, is a major obstacle. But you've got a pattern of, again, here they have a large gateway. Now, most of the gateways on the wall were either in a Roman fort or in one of the mile castles. There were two gateways where the two north-south roads met the wall, a little bit like this, where there was clearly a path through. Whether those were still active by 5th century is another matter, and they probably weren't quite as grand as that. Wherever there's a fort gateway north of the wall, it's always a double gateway. But again, you know, fair enough. This is Hollywood. It's not supposed to be a museum or anything. Another thing that this can help point out about the wall is that it's incredibly impressive visually. And this and the other films do well. It does stretch from horizon to horizon. Now, most of the people north of the wall come from cultures that live in pretty basic housing that simply could not dream of building anything on this scale. So there's an element of sort of psychological intimidation just by its sheer size, its grandeur, and the fact that it is so big and it just goes from horizon to horizon. On the other hand, they might think, well, why do these damn fool Romans build something like that? What's the point of that? But, you know, the Romans feel this is intimidating. There's talk in sources of Germanic tribes that maintain this depopulated strip of land around their territory as a warning to people, basically a keep off sign. The Belgic tribes, Caesar says, they grew thick thorn hedges, again, at the edge of their territory, basically sort of keep off. You know, come any further than this and you'll get attacked. And actually, Caesar's army does get attacked as it's crossing these hedges or in that area. So there's an element of that. Hadrian's Wall probably didn't face too many direct assaults of the sort depicted in films like this, because mainly the army, if a force like this turns up, then what the Romans should do normally is gather together parts of the garrisons from a distance either way. There's a fort with an auxiliary unit every 7.5, 8 miles or so along the wall. You gather a field army together, you march out, you hit it in the open. Again, because you're better than they are. You've got the discipline, you've got the equipment, you've got the tactics, the command structure that makes you a far more flexible force. So the wall isn't really designed as a fighting platform, or in this film, they use it as a sort of trap, a barrier. Again, it's very Hollywood that some of the German groups will attack in, be wiped out, but you know the gates have closed, so they can't see what's happening. It's just that nobody comes back, all this sort of thing. So it's an okay take on the wall, but it takes a fair few liberties with it, with the evidence as well. So we're coming on to the last legion, which is set 460 AD-ish, that sort of time. It's, you know, King Arthur's story, Romulus Augustulus, last emperor, all that sort of thing is all mangled together a bit, and it's fanciful, should we say? It's based on a novel, so you can't expect too much. They've got Hadrian's Wall still there in pretty good nick. I mean, it's similar to the sort we've seen in King Arthur, and again, no ditch. The turrets are there. The turrets don't have roofs on them. There's a debate over whether that's not the case or not. Everybody forms up against this mass attack, and they all sort of form up in the fort and along the wall, using it like a castle. Now, the wall is 80 Roman miles long, 74 or so imperial miles. You're never going to defend the whole thing like that. It's not what it's designed for. Again, it's a patrolling platform. It restricts movement through it, and it's something that makes it hard for anyone to move through without you allowing them. It's not there, contrary to Rudyard Kipling and Puck of Boots Hill and this sort of thing, for you to have fight-off massed attacks. If it gets to the point where the locals can attack you in these sorts of numbers, then you're in serious trouble because the garrisons are weak. So that's quite interesting. And as I say, this is fanciful. It probably looks a bit more castle-like than it should. However, there's some interesting stuff in that even though Formally, the Roman province of Britain ends about 410, and a few years before that, Roman coinage simply stops coming into Britain very, very abruptly, which means that people working for the state, working for the empire, soldiers, administrators, that sort of thing, they're not being paid. It's as clear a sign as you can get of this falling out of the sort of the imperial system. It just goes. However, it's interesting that some local leaders keep using bits of Hadrian's Wall for several generations afterwards. So at Vindolanda Fort, which is just south of the wall, somebody repairs the walls fairly sort of crudely, lots of earth and timber to fill gaps in stone walls, but nevertheless, somebody is occupying it. It's probably become a sort of small fortified town rather than a base for regular soldiers. Um, Similar things happen at Housesteads. There's traces there. At Bird Oswald Fort, something that's very similar happens, but there, quite strikingly, somebody builds on the foundations of the Roman granary, which were big, solid stone buildings. They build a timber feasting hall, straight out of Beowulf, straight out of Viking sagas, this sort of thing, is built in this Roman fort. And they clearly repair the defenses, keep those in. So it seems to become the stronghold for a local war leader, a Romano-British tribal leader. So people are sort of still using these bases, or at least some of them, as centers of power. How much of the wall itself is still there is hard to say. Bede, a little bit later, talks about it still being 10 foot high, and it's nowhere near 10 foot high in any of the remnants now. If you go there today, you might be a bit disappointed by what's left of Hadrian's Wall. It's still worth doing. It's spectacular country. The sites are terrific. Heartily recommended. I love the place. But most of Hadrian's Wall has been stolen over the centuries to build farmhouses, churches, farm walls, all this sort of thing. So Hadrian's Wall has spread out for miles in either direction because the locals have just used this as a quarry. So that's why there's less of it left than we would like. There are similar things going on in a few other sites in 5th century Britain. So the Roman Empire no longer controls Britain after 410, possibly a year or so before. But it's not fallen away completely, even though eventually we'll lose Roman law, we'll lose literacy, we'll lose Christianity in Roman Britain as the Angles and the Saxons, people like that, take over. At places like Hadrian's Wall, you can see that this transition's a lot more gradual, a lot more complicated, perhaps because there aren't such vast numbers of these invaders coming in, at least at first. But again, this is where we're trying to tell a story just from the archaeology, and often it intrigues us so far and then leaves lots of different possibilities open. But this is a sort of fitting end to Hadrian's Wall in the movies. It's interesting that you have to think of Hadrian's Wall as a base from which the Romans can project their power forward. And coin hoards turn up where Roman silver has gone north to buy the loyalty of chieftains. It's nearly always found in the far north, beyond where the Antonine Wall is, right up in the real highlands of Scotland. And it looks as if you bothered to bribe the leaders who were far enough away that it was hard to go and hit them with a sort of punitive expedition, so that anyone who lives closer to the wall, within sort of 50, 60 miles or so, you know where they live. They're fairly easy to reach. If they cause trouble, they know that you're going to come and burn their house down. To send an expedition right up beyond the Fourth Clyde line into the mountains, that's a major project that you'll probably be more reluctant to do. So it's almost sort of showing you how Rome's reach starts to fade, gets a bit weaker, can't quite stretch the whole way. But again, basic thing about Hadrian's Wall is it isn't the fortification itself so much that matters. It's the soldiers manning it, stationed on it, what they do. And those are a mobile field force, because that's what the Roman army was and what it was good at, that can move beyond the fortifications, reach out and hit the enemy, which we get hints of in the films, but it isn't always, they tend to simplify because obviously they're trying to just tell a story, and sometimes maybe they've thought about it in a way that doesn't draw on all the evidence. But this is a mobile army. The wall is there to make the soldiers more effective, make it harder for people to get in, even harder for them to get out, so that you can control the frontier with fewer people, so it's cheaper for the state, less dangerous for the state. So that's really the idea of it. But it's nice that we've got these cinematic depictions of Hadrian's Wall in the first place to give us something to help us think about that reality, try and get back to understand what was going on, what the wall was for.